All right, I guess we can go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Matt Stevens. I'm really glad you all could attend our sessions today on demystifying data governance. I'm here with my colleague Autumn and Michael Vente, who I'll let introduce themselves in a moment. But really glad you could be here for this session. Really the goals for this session are to talk a little bit more, kind of dive in a little bit deeper about data governance and how it really applies to our day-to-day work. We're going to have a conversation with Michael from Colorado about what data governance looks like on the ground in Colorado, and really learn some good lessons from the work that they're doing in Colorado. And then we're going to kind of change things up a little bit and have a little bit of a participatory fun activity where we're going to dive into a kind of a simulated data governance board meeting as a group and kind of illustrate what data governance really looks like in practice. Introduce the concept of a data governance charter and give us a chance to kind of all participate and experience what it really means to bring that document to life through a data governance process. And then we'll leave some time at the end for questions and answers. Chance for you all to ask Michael or us any questions about data governance or anything we covered in the session. And then that'll be it. So I will turn it over to, let each of my co-participants introduce themselves. Michael, do you want to start? Introduce yourself and talk a little bit about why data governance matters to you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Matt and Autumn. Great to be with you all today. My name is Michael Vente. I'm the Senior Director of Research and Data Governance at the Colorado Department of Higher Education. I would say I probably lean into that second half of my title more and more these days, the data governance part, as we think about all of the exciting things that we're doing in Colorado around this space, both in terms of data sharing, data governance, and being able to really leverage that work to do so much and really, I think, energize us in so many different ways. In a lot of ways, I see this as really important because in putting my state agency hat on, I really see our ability to talk about outcomes for certain programs, for example, or just being able to best leverage data to tell the story of what's going on in terms of people and what they're doing. Really being able to help our efforts in terms of consumer protection and being able to really provide individuals with robust information when they're making a whole host of decisions. I think a lot of our work in this space has kind of started and grown and continues to grow when we talk about the return on investment for post-secondary education training and education programs. So being able to really lean into that work and leverage the work in terms of data sharing as best we can to help inform students of all of the different opportunities that are available to them and the types of outcomes that they can expect when they are navigating all of that. So that's why this work is important to me.
I'll go ahead and go. So I'm Autumn Felty. I am BrightHive's data governance lead. My role here at BrightHive is really to step in whenever the data sharing collaborations that we're working on are ready to tackle those sticky data governance issues. What should decision-making structures look like? What are the roles and responsibilities? And then how is all of that formalized? Oftentimes using a charter, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. I started my career back at the State Department of Education here in Oklahoma. Actually, shout out to Nancy Smith, who is on. Hi, Nancy. If you guys didn't have a chance to listen in on the keynote, we're going to be posting that to our BrightHive's YouTube channel. I highly recommend it. The conversation was great. But anyway, I started at the State Department of Education in the Federal Programs Office, and then I shortly thereafter transitioned to the Student Information Office. But while I was in federal programs, at that time, we were transitioning from the district's annual reporting being done through mailing in these 6-inch binders full of paper, that described their entire school system and their students and everything about how they functioned, to sending all of that in rather than on paper on flash drives, which was a huge improvement, right? I remember I was one of the folks who, when the mail came in each day, it was very exciting to go through and see which districts had sent in their flash drives. I pull an envelope out of the kind of mail pile, and there's this, legal envelope, and it doesn't appear to have anything in it. And I notice that there's a little rip in the bottom corner, just this big enough for a flash drive to fall out of. So unfortunately, that district's data all about their school, how they work, their students, was lost somewhere in the US postal system. So, fast forward a little while later, I am in the student information office. My role there was to stand up a data governance structure for the Department of Education. Nancy Smith, the first time I met her, she was our contractor. She kind of began my informal education and data governance, and she was a wonderful mentor and has been to this day. But as I learned about data governance and what it is designed to do, I always thought back to those binders sitting in file cabinets and that lost flash drive, and thought, well, what if there were governance structures in place that supported using the data and also alleviating the burden on those who are providing that really valuable data to the education system, and then providing them the opportunity to get value back out of it. So that's always my goal whenever regardless of the context, or I think about governance in data sharing collaboratives, how can we alleviate burden? How can we formalize the decisions around data, make sure it's protected, and then also provide that data back in a valuable way to those who it represents. So that's why data governance matters to me.
And I'm Matt Stevens. I'm the director of data trusts at BrightHive. Similar to Autumn, I work really closely with our partners in the government and nonprofit sector to form data collaboratives and be able to share and govern their data towards kind of overcoming data sharing challenges towards a common goal. My relationship with data governance, it's really been, I think, similar to what Autumn described, kind of learned on the job. And I think that might be a common thread. It's not necessarily something that you learn about in school. My background was in statistics, and if I think back to when data governance really wasn't a part of that curriculum. Most of the data that we used for our projects and our homework examples came on either a CD or was emailed to us by the professor. At best, there might be a session on how do you clean up messy data, but even that was really approached from the perspective of what are those data cleaning decisions you're making as a researcher or as an individual data analyst, and maybe at best you're documenting those so that the research can be recreated, but you're not really getting upstream to understand where the data came from or what types of decisions could be made in one place and documented that met the needs of a lot of potential data users downstream. And so as I got my start, I was working in a nonprofit organization leading our data analytics and data science teams. And that's really where data governance became a lot more real. A lot of the challenges we were facing in just being able to do our day-to-day reporting were really issues of data governance more than issues of data analysis. And so as we started to get upstream a little bit and make those decisions about how we could store our data to meet the needs of all of our internal and external kind of people who needed, I guess, the information out of our reports, it became clear to me that we were relying on data from other organizations. And so data governance really needed to be a collaborative exercise because each agency and each organization could be having these conversations internally. But if you're making different decisions about the data or you're making decisions without considering the needs of those potential external users, you're creating a lot of redundant activities. And so really a lot of what we do at BrightHive and what we're going to talk about today is what does it look like to collaboratively govern data? Everybody has their piece of what they're contributing that they may be the data steward for, but how does that conversation and process change and evolve when you start to work together towards common goals? So really, I think if anybody in the audience, has any other particular thoughts on data governance, there's the hand raising option in the participants window of Zoom. I'd be happy to hear from a couple people before diving into this session. All right, well, we'll have a chance for question and answers and thoughts on data governance later. So I think if we don't have any immediate volunteers, I'm not going to call anybody out. I guess we can go ahead and get started with our conversation with Michael Vente. So thank you, Michael, for joining us today. Really excited to hear a little bit more about the work that you're doing in Colorado. As I mentioned, in my introduction, I've had the honor and the opportunity to work really closely with Michael over the past year and a half with some of the work that BrightHive has been doing in Colorado, but was really excited when I first started doing that work to see just how much really cool data governance work was already happening in the state. So Michael, I guess maybe just as a starting point, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what the data governance and data collaboration landscape looks like in Colorado.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I always tell people that there's a lot of great organic energy in Colorado around all of these things that we're talking about. Being able to lean into innovation, leaning into all of these various ways that we can work collaboratively together to be able to combine data, to make data an asset for all Coloradans. I think that's something that's at the core of a lot of what we do from a state agency perspective in being able to help facilitate that work. So a couple of the strands that I think of, and there are a whole host of other strands as well, but just to kind of call out a few, kind of overarching a lot of what we do in Colorado, we have the Government Data Advisory Board, or GDAB. That's a group where we have different representatives from each Colorado state agency coming to the table and being able to talk about what we are doing together and or separately, and what we can do collaboratively within this ecosystem around data sharing and being able to link data across different state agencies for various use cases. So a lot of what that group has been really focused on very recently has been around the health and human services space, of course, in reaction to COVID and being able to help serve Coloradans as best we can on that front, but also being able to think about the cross-eligibility for some of the public benefits programs. So thinking about Medicaid, thinking about WIC and TANF and SNAP, and being able to see, are there ways that the data between the various different state health agencies in Colorado, ways that those data can be shared or used together in order to help get more individuals who might be eligible for these benefits actually receiving these benefits. So I think that's a great space that they've been really focused on recently, and really excited about where that's going to go in the future. I'd also say we have the Linked Information Network of Colorado, or LINK with a C for short. The GDAB is located within our Office of Information Technology at its own state agency here in Colorado. The Linked Information Network of Colorado is another arm that lives under OIT and the work that they do. A lot of that work has been supported by the Colorado Evaluation and Action Lab. They've been a wonderful partner in being able to think about ways to knit together data to help put that together and connect us with researchers to do robust academic analyses that then help inform bold policy. And so I think that's something that has been super helpful, and so I'm so thankful that the lab has stood up that work and been able to integrate that into OIT's operations. So very broadly, being able to take various data sets from agencies, identify a research question, and be able to knit together those data and then de-identify it so that the researcher can then really dig into what that might look like. And so leveraging that whole process has been extremely helpful, and being able to delve into a whole host of topics that I think are really interesting, that again help inform the governor's office and all of us in terms of what policies might work best for Coloradans. And then of course, the data trust that we're building with BrightHive's help, that's related to the My Colorado Journey experience. So being able through our My Colorado Journey platform to be able to provide this pathway and this more holistic experience when it comes to education and training and workforce opportunities. So being able to reach a student of any age and be able to provide them with all the different pathways that are available to them when it comes to post post-secondary education, and how those track into different workforce outcomes, whether they're workforce opportunities, earnings outcomes, whatever it might be, and being able to provide it within the My Colorado Journey experience. And then powering all that, of course, is the data trust that brings together all of the different agencies who are at that table to seamlessly share those data via the data trust, and then being able to think about the use cases for MCJ, My Colorado Journey, but also other use cases that might pop up that really help inform the whole field about all the wide array of education and training opportunities out there. So those are a couple of the strands that I think of, and again, trying to do the best we can to kind of connect the dots between all of these different things so that we're all working together and moving in the same direction.
That's great. Yeah, it seems like a lot of great opportunities, for efficiency, for repeatability of data that gets created. A lot of good successes there. What have been some of the challenges that these initiatives either faced and that they were brought about to solve, or challenges you've run into as these initiatives have taken off?
Sure. So, I think, again, great energy from so many, a lot of enthusiasm, trying to harness that as best we can. Sometimes we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, depending on the world in which we experience it. So I think it was great. The panel this morning talked a little bit about the legal challenges that we can all face when it comes to lawyers, and in our case, our Attorney General's office, and what this looks like from their perspective. So I think being able to work with them and explain what we're trying the direction we're trying to go, the end goal that we have in mind, and being able to have that vantage point. I can't remember who said it this morning. It might have been Kristen, to be able to, or Nancy, who mentioned being able to think about the different perspectives, at least from a state agency, when it comes to data sharing. I think a lot of the history around data in state agencies has been from that compliance standpoint. And I fully recognize that I'm maybe one of the weirdos out there who is trying to change things and trying to kind of move things in a different direction. So working with my state agency colleagues in being able to move in this direction, understand kind of where they're coming from, and be able to kind of meet them where they are, and hopefully get them to come over to our direction and move in that direction and row those oars as best we can. I would say one of the setbacks that maybe we've had, but this is all a learning experience as we do these things. I think of one example when we talk about kind of that public benefit space and trying to get more individuals who might be eligible for this receiving those benefits, especially those who are within post-secondary education. So being able to tell that story, I think, is so valuable and so important. So bringing together all the agencies who are involved in that, and then as we're all sitting down at the table together with our enthusiasm, realizing that we don't have a common identifier between all of these data sets, and that identity resolution and being able to navigate that is extremely important and vital to be able to do some of this work. So being able to kind of maybe taking a step back, going back to the drawing board and saying, how do we go forward from here, and really trying to be creative as best we can to crack those nuts as they are presented to us.
That makes a lot of sense. It does sound like, based on the use cases you've described, that there's probably a lot of common players and common agencies across these different initiatives. How do these initiatives learn from or inform one another as you run into these challenges? Is there a lot of cross-pollination where, as you overcome data sharing challenges with one of these, it is something that you can reuse in another conversation?
Absolutely. I think as we have more conversations with our state agency partners who maybe don't have the same identifiers that we do, or have different goals than we do, I think it's being able to just sit down together and be able to say, how do we tackle this? And also, we're doing this over here and then this over here. How do we ensure that learning from each other and be able to help facilitate that as best we can? One example that I think of is around that identity resolution space. Through some of the link conversations, we've thought about how our DMV can maybe play a role in that space, and working with them to kind of explain our goals, where we want to go, and what we're trying to get out of these things, I think is something that helps inform some of that research work that Link can do, and again, being able to do that identity resolution across data sets. I think a lot of that could be learnings for the data trust in being able to think about what does that mean, and what are the use cases that could be possible if we had that collaboration. So what I try to do as best I can is being a fly on the wall in conversations and chiming in when I think it's helpful, and being able to connect these dots so that we're again going in the same direction, that we're all learning from each other in this work.
Yeah. And it seems to me that, and we'll talk, I think, a little bit about this later in the governance charter kind of exercise, but it really is that governance process, I guess, that allows some of those lessons to be documented and reused. Because when we're being explicit about why is this data from DMV necessary for Link for identity resolution, and you're being really clear about how it can and can't be used, that breaks down a lot of those concerns or those barriers that might have slowed those conversations down in the past.
And absolutely, and I would probably also add in the importance of senior leadership in a lot of this work. We as data folks can have a lot of great ideas and a lot of great enthusiasm, but making sure that we have that buy-in from senior leadership. And I will say, our executive director, Dr. Angie Piccioni, is very supportive of the work that we're doing at the Department of Higher Ed. I would also say Governor Polis, his office is extremely supportive of being able to lean into this work and really seeing the value of all of these use cases that we bring up. So I think that's super exciting and something that I hope we can harness even more as we go forward.
Yeah, that's great. I think you mentioned compliance earlier, and I think, sometimes there's a bit of a misconception. I think that governance is more of a compliance activity, but in your experience, what are some of the ways that governance can really support and unlock innovation within the data space?
Absolutely. Well, I think when I go to a lot of our data trust conversations that we have when it comes to My Colorado Journey, with that whole space, being able to kind of be at that table, the table that's created by the charter and created by this, maybe compliance perspective when it comes to data sharing, it really enables us to bubble up all of these different ideas and being able to think about how we can work together. So for instance, I think about the data trust work and how that works with My Colorado Journey. I know some of our colleagues at the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment, I think it was last year, got a WDQI grant. And so being able to leverage the data trust to do some of that work and being able to see how these things kind of link together, and we wouldn't maybe necessarily have those conversations if we weren't all coming together at this data trust committee and being able to talk about that. I'd also say, kind of from the GDAB perspective as well, the GDAB is a little bit more of that place where we can kind of bring ideas together. We have certain people who are members of that committee who are appointed by the executive directors of agencies. So it's kind of complying with executive orders and all the rest, which is not always the most fun thing, but being able to bring these people to the table, we get so much out of these conversations, just to be able to compare notes and to be able to understand what people are doing, and then be able to say, this thing that I want to do over here is really similar to this thing that you are doing. Let's work together. And I feel like those conversations in a lot of ways wouldn't happen if not for some of these more compliance activities.
That makes a lot of sense. We're getting a lot of good questions in the chat. I think we have a little bit of time at the end for Q&A, so I may hold these until the very end. I have one more question, and then I think I may turn it over to Autumn for some of the more specific data governance related questions. I think privacy is an issue that comes up a lot with data sharing initiatives, and it's something, especially in state government. What's been the role of privacy in these data governance conversations throughout these initiatives?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's, of course, and very rightly so, something that people bring up a lot when it comes to whether it's a FERPA thing, a HIPAA thing, or some other state statute thing, when we talk about privacy and making sure that we are in compliance with all of that. I will say one of the things that I've tried to help facilitate as best I can with all of my colleagues is moving to a place where data sharing is the rule, not the exception. And so one of the things that our executive director, Dr. Piccioni, mentions a lot is, yes, we have things in terms of compliance. We have rules that we have to adhere to, and sometimes those can be barriers. Given all of that, how do we work together and how do we move to a place to where we want to go with all of that in mind? And so I think that has been, of course, and rightly so, a central component of all of our discussions, but it's also being able to say, what does that actually mean? And what can we do to ensure privacy, but still achieve the goals that we've set out? And I think through the data trust conversations and the link conversations and the GDAP conversations, we've done a lot of that. And so I'm very hopeful that we can continue all of that work and we can continue the work of getting to the place where that data sharing is the rule, not the exception.
Yeah, I really like that. That reminds me of what we were talking about the other day when we were kind of preparing for this session. Thinking about the exercise we're going to do is a little bit of improvisational activity, and what we said around how improv comedy and data governance really should take, in a lot of ways take the same approach, right? The number one rule of improv comedy is how do we all work together to keep the scene going? And that rule is yes and, right? When someone throws out some improvisational aspect, it's the person receives it with yes, agreeing, and this is the thing I'm going to add to this. And of course, with data sharing, that doesn't mean yes, I'm going to share all of my data and you can have it without restriction, but it is, like you said, making data sharing not the exception. So how can we all work together with a common goal in that way? Awesome. Autumn, do you have a couple more questions for Michael before we dive into the activity?
Yeah, I thought that I would ask just kind of a few, maybe more in the detail, kind of procedural type questions. First, could you go through kind of who the key players are for each of those three groups and maybe discuss any overlap and how that works or causes tension between them?
Sure, absolutely. So what I've tried to do as best I can, within the link conversations or the data trust conversations or the GJAB conversations, is trying to make those people the same as much as makes sense. It's not always going to work, but being able to have those people, and so we're having similar conversations, and everyone's kind of approaching these things from that perspective. So in the CDHE, Department of Higher Ed example, I am our member on each one of those things, and trying to help facilitate our state agency partners to kind of see things the same way as well, just to be able to kind of get that streamlined approach. I will say from the GDAP perspective, sometimes the representatives on that committee are more really focused on data. And so these are the nitty-gritty data folks, really being able to kind of get into the weeds about certain data sets and thinking higher level within their agencies. What are those technical considerations when it comes to data, and what does that mean and look like? So I think that's super helpful, and so thankful for their input on all of those fronts. I'd say on the link perspective, sometimes it's the same GDAB people, but also it takes kind of a research approach, because again, a lot of the link use cases are more research projects. And so being able to have those representatives from different state agencies who can maybe dip their toe into the research end and the data end are usually the people that are part of those link conversations. And so I think that's great for that group, because a lot of those use cases are, again, focusing on those more academic research projects. And in the case of the data trust, I think where we've landed is having those individuals who really see the value of all of these use cases that we're bringing up. So being able to have those representatives and being able to have their expertise and being able to really use their enthusiasm for the various use cases that might come forward. So, with all of these groups, that's a lot of people that I'm talking about who are coming together and talking and chatting on a regular basis. Again, what I try to do is try to make those maybe the same people at similar meetings. That certainly helps. But everyone brings that great perspective. And so, being able to bring that perspective to all of those groups is something that I really like doing, and hopefully do well. I'll also say another group that I'll mention is someone who's in the chat today, Taylor Kendall with Learning Economy, really being able to leverage all of the C-Lab work that his group has been doing, and talking about things like blockchain, talking about a whole host of other use cases, and being able to bring these perspectives to that group as well. And I think that is super helpful, because then again, we're all rowing in the same direction when it comes to our goals.
Yep, that's great. I think earlier you mentioned how important it was to have the support kind of at that executive level. Can you talk a little bit about what was the kind of journey towards gaining that support? Was it just an automatic, were they super progressive and just loved the thought of governance from the start? Or were there any kind of foundational activities or conversations that had to take place to get that buy-in to allow these groups to move forward?
Sure. I think for a lot of that work, it really comes down to the use cases that you identify. So being able to say, an executive director might not get into executive director, CEO, governor, whoever it might be, might not really get into the weeds when it comes to some of these data sharing, data interoperability, all of that kind of stuff. Maybe they do, and that's wonderful and great. But if they don't, I think it's being able to illustrate what we can do via all of these use cases, and being able to say, hey, we have this project over here that we really want to get done. In order to do that, we need to do X, Y, and Z. And I think being able to kind of get them on board by showcasing the use case is the great way to kind of get them on the hook for this great work. And I would say that in a specific example, within our governor's office, the Office of State Planning and Budget, OSPB, deals with a lot of the budget asks on a yearly basis that we go through in Colorado, and what that looks like. And so what they've done is they've really incorporated a lot of the link work into being able to say what kind of intervention or what kind of action it shows promise, and being able to be able to say through a research prism, whether it's through Link and the Colorado Evaluation and Action Lab, or maybe another study, being able to say, in order for us to really lean into that work, being able to see the effectiveness is important. And so being able to elevate that and kind of make that something that they want to see makes all of our conversations a little bit easier, because we can say, well, in order to get that, we need to be able to have this data sharing or to be able to do these things. And so I think it's planting those seeds at various places, and hopefully they take root.
Great. And then I think my last question is around longevity. So in state government, particularly, elected officials leave office. What type of formalization is in place for each of those groups, or maybe one, if you want to hone in on one, that ensures that the governance structure outlives the folks who are involved in it at any given time? Maybe talk about documentation or process around those sorts of things.
Sure. And this maybe gets to one of Nancy's questions that she has in the chat. Link does not have a legislative mandate, unfortunately, but I think one of the things that we've tried to do with the GDAB, with Link, with the data trust, is being able to, I'll go back to those use cases, and just making those use cases so exciting and so riveting that people stay with us through all of these things. We, a couple of years ago, went through a governor transition in Colorado, and I think that was something that we had in mind, was being able to say, through that transition, how do we make these things embedded within all of our work at the state agency level, and being able to leverage these to get certain outcomes, and being able to show our new governor, hey, this is what we're doing, this is the bang for the buck that we all get, and really getting them on board early. So I think that was successful, and being able to show, because of our riveting use cases and because of this work, look at what we can do if we keep these things going and we lean into them even more. And so I think that was successful from our vantage point, and that's something we continue to kind of get those really shiny use cases as best we can.
Nice, thank you. I'm going to share my screen again, and then Matt will kind of get us on our journey towards our improvisational activity, which we expect each and every one of you to participate in. So,
Data governance is collaborative. We're going to need some
that's
help.
right.
Yeah, so I think it's very fitting that Michael focused on those use cases, because I think what we want to be able to do here in this exercise is make this a little bit more concrete. I think these really great lessons from the ground, and now we want to think about what would it take to put a data governance process in place for a hypothetical data sharing activity, describe a little bit what data we're talking about, and then once we've set the scene, have a couple of audience participants volunteer to join in to help play a role in this conversation to help us make this decision about how this data collaborative is going to grow to better serve the needs of the Good Tech Fest data collaborative. So, we tried to kind of set this metaphor up of thinking about this as data governance as a one-act play. And so, setting the scene, really, in order for data governance to work, what's already going on in the background is that there needs to be some sort of legal and ethical framework in place. Data governance isn't necessarily going to replace the need for data sharing agreements or permission for data to be shared, but it is going to build on top of that to allow those combinations of kind of bilateral data sharing agreements to meet all those sustainable long-term goals like Michael described in his answers. And also, there is the technical infrastructure in place, and it can vary, right? It's not some magical platform necessarily. It could be, it could also be SFTP. Any technology you have in place, really, the go-to here is whatever technology can get you going, with data sharing right away is good enough and a great place to start. And through your data governance process will allow you to iteratively improve that. So then identifying the characters, who needs to be involved in your data governance conversation? It's a combination of data contributors as well. Will it also state that potential advocates around data? So from the data contributor standpoint, Michael mentioned the different state agencies that participated in the initiatives in Colorado, but even within those agencies, who is the right individual or what is the right role to be making, who has the authority to make decisions around data sharing or around technology decisions? You really want the people at the table to be stewards of the data so that, especially if they're stewards of data that is already allowed to be shared in clearly defined ways. Some of the examples that we'll give today really build upon data that is required to be shared for federal reporting. And so sometimes unlocking those data sets is a really great place to start. And so having the stewards of that data at the table really helps. You need individuals who are familiar enough with the data that they have a clear understanding of what data is being governed. But also maybe not so much in the details that they don't lose sight of kind of the larger goals of this initiative. So it's really someone kind of in that sweet spot. It's also sometimes helpful to have those IT or data infrastructure subject matter experts who can chime in around what is technically possible right now or what some of the privacy and security limitations might be at this point in time in your data sharing initiative. And then it's really important that especially if you're pulling these individuals from different agencies who have their own goals, that there is some sort of common goal or that they have a shared stakeholder or a shared pain point. So in a state agency, situation, each agency may have a relationship with Coloradans and a specific aspect that they are responsible for, but all the state agencies have these common stakeholders who are residents of the state of Colorado. And these data collaborations can allow for really a human-centered approach to governing data with the residents and their needs in mind. And then finally, in terms of advocates, it's really helpful to have all of these, people thinking about the data who are the data stewards, but sometimes if you can have an advocate for the people who the data is on, you'll get an additional perspective that may help the long-term sustainability of thif data sharing initiatives. These could be students or parents or service recipients or advocates of these groups to make sure that that perspective of if I was a student, how would I feel comfortable having my data used or not used, or what data that gets created would be valuable or less valuable for my needs. It's an important perspective, and the earlier that you can have that voice in the conversation, the less likely that you're sharing data to create things that are not particularly useful for people. And then finally, how do you write the script for this scene? And that's really what we're going to talk about with the data governance charter. The charter really codifies and documents the key aspects of a data sharing initiative, things like, and we'll go into this in more detail, how are decisions made, what are the values and the motivations that this group comes together that align around, that shape the collaboration, and what are our common goals. And really, once this charter gets filled out, it's a document that serves as that guiding North Star for how decisions are made and how data sharing is implemented throughout the life of the project. And it's a document, but it's not, you know, carved in stone, right? It's designed to evolve with the initiative and really ensure the sustainability. So you start with one goal, but make sure that this framework provides enough structure to say, when do we meet next to make that next decision, but not so rigid that once we've made decisions, our hands are tied about what we can do in the future. So for our activity today, let's all, you know, kind of imagine that we are part of this Good Tech Fest. Well, we don't have to imagine, we are part of this Good Tech Fest Data Governance Board. And we are now in a virtual data governance meeting. Autumn is going to be playing the role of the Good Tech Fest Department of Data Impact and Collaboration, and will serve as the trustee of this data governance conversation. Michael, with his higher education background, has now been elected as our Good Tech Fest representative for the Good Tech Fest Department of Higher Education. And I will put on my labor hat and be the data steward for the Good Tech Fest Department of Labor. And so on the next slide, I'll just kind of talk about you know, what has this imaginary data governance board shared in the past, and that'll really set the stage for this new use case that we're going to propose. We want to incorporate data about public benefit receipt because we've been able to historically calculate employment outcomes for people receiving different workforce trainings. And now we want to be able to understand, well, if someone goes to a workforce training and is receiving public benefits, you know, does that improve their likelihood of employment and the amount of wage that they might receive on the other side of that training program? But there's some data that we'll need to share in order to make that use case come to life. And so Autumn is going to open the charter, and we will kind of ground that discussion in our governance board shared goals. Before we get into the charter, Autumn, should I go through that slide, just kind of outlining what data we've shared to date?
Yeah, let's do that. 1 second.
I kind of changed the order of these around.
That's okay.
Oh no, I brought a flow chart. I will try my best to describe this at a very high level very quickly. So on the left side, you've got data, the data contributors from this data collaboration. And so far, we have contributed a few different data sets to this data trust or this data collaborative. The Department of Higher Education has provided data on the training providers and the training programs that are available in our state through our Good Tech Fest ETPL eligible training provider list, which of course we have one of those as the Good Tech Fest Data Governance Board. We also have individual level data, a little bit more sensitive about the individuals who have participated in these training programs. And then in the past, my Department of Labor has also approved contributing UI wage data to this data collaborative. And so just to be clear, we've only approved putting this in a data trust. We haven't necessarily approved everyone having access to this data. And so then what this governance board has done in the past is we have voted on how can each of these data sets be combined in approved ways and uses, which we'll go over in the charter, how we've kind of backed that up, and who has permission to access these created data sets. And so from the training provider and program data, we've consolidated those across a lot of different geographies to create a consolidated list of all of the training providers and all of the training programs. And in order to create value for residents of our jurisdiction, we have made these data sets, which are publicly available, specifically available via API to third-party app provider number 1 and third-party app provider number 2, so that they can get this information in front of students and learners and workers throughout the state. Then we've also approved a use case where we are going to calculate wage and employment outcomes for each of those training programs to meet some federally mandated reporting requirements that create this reporting data that is then shared with the US Department of Labor to meet those reporting requirements. And once that data was allowed to be created for these federally mandated purposes, we also decided we would like to create some additional return on investment metrics and make those metrics about training programs available via that third-party application so that learners could compare the value of different training programs and get a sense for, if I go through this training program versus this training program, what can I expect my employment and wage outcomes to be? And so this use case that we're going to propose in just a second through the charter is we want to be able to contribute data about what public benefits these training participants received, not so that that information can be made publicly available, because clearly that's private and sensitive information, but so that we could start to understand what are those outcomes for people who go through training programs with different combinations of benefits to support them through that program and make sure that they are able to fully participate and afford training programs. So with that, let's jump into the charter.
Yes, we have been a very busy governance board, as you guys can see. And let me just figure out how to, here we go. Okay, so this is a charter document. It's a template that we're going to make available to you guys after this session. And I'm just going to really quickly walk through the charter, and we're getting really close to 10 minutes to the hour. So I think this is going to just be a very quick activity. But I do want to go through this charter because the charter is a really important foundational document. And it can be really useful for governance boards, both as you're kind of formalizing your governance process. And then once it's in place, it's a great touchstone to go back to whenever really sticky issues come up and you're not really sure maybe what the right path forward is. The charter includes a lot of the kind of foundational information for your governance sharing collaborative or your governance program in general, such as where does the authority for your governance structure live? Where does it come from? How are you guys able to make these types of decisions? A mission statement. It's important to always have that to come back to whenever you get into a place where you're not sure how to move forward. And then the goals and objectives. And this is relevant to our use case that we're discussing today. So a goal that we identified back when we first formed this governance board was that the residents of Colorado, or Good Tech Fest, should have clear, thorough, accurate information that is needed to make decisions about training opportunities. And then a couple of the objectives that we identified are to make training and education program data easily accessible to education seekers, and to provide education seekers with the information they need to make informed excuse me, decisions about training and education programs that could best meet their needs. We list here the membership, so you guys have all been made aware of our roles. It would be helpful if we had an end user advocate present at this meeting. So I was wondering if anybody would like to be brave and volunteer to very quickly serve as our end user advocate for the purposes of this discussion.
Sure, I'll do it.
Yay, thank you, Kristen. And then just really quickly to remind you all of how we vote. So we vote in person, and we're going to use the raise hand function in your Zoom to vote for the initiative. We're a majority voting model. So if you don't raise your hand, then you're essentially voting against the new use case. And We have these kind of paths forward for this particular use case. We can vote yes, majority rule, and we would move into implementation. If it fails, then we have kind of 3 paths forward. So we can vote no and say, you know what, we just need a little bit more information. So data stewards would go back, gather the information at our next governance board meeting. We will have all reviewed that, and then we would feel better about coming to a final decision. Or we can form a short-term work group that consists of data stewards who are experts in this area. They would get together, meet a few times, gather all of the important information, synthesize it down, and then bring a package back to our next governance board meeting that we would feel comfortable voting on. Or we can just say, no, never, we're not going to do this, forget about it. Whatever the decision is, we will formally document it in a charter, a change management log, and then we will continue on with our governance decision making. So, Matt, do you want to maybe restate quickly what the use cases that we're voting on, if you have that handy?
Yeah, I can do that. So the use case that we are voting on is to have the Good Tech Fest Department of Human Services, who I guess I can also play the role of that data representative, to have them contribute individual level data about public benefit receipt to our data governance collaboration, with the purpose of being able to calculate wage and employment outcomes on people who both go through training programs and have public benefits. We would capture that way more succinctly in the governance document.
That's right. So just to kind of kick off discussion, I personally love data. That's why my role is the data impact and collaboration person here. So I think it's great. I think we should have all the data and we should use it to allow folks to better understand the benefits of particular programs and services. So I'm an advocate for this.
And from the Department of Higher Ed perspective, I would also be an advocate of this. I feel like we want to move more and more into the space of the social determinants of student success. So what are those human needs that an individual has to get through some sort of post-secondary education or training opportunity? And so knowing more about the effect that public benefits can have on student success, I think is extremely interesting and something that we would absolutely support.
So I'm wondering, as the advocate here, if we have thought about how the data we're sharing could be used by the agencies we're sharing it with. Are there provisions in place for its application to be limited? Can it be sold? Have we thought about the implications here? Hat tip to Shirley, by the way.
I think to follow on, I have a question even about what do we mean by services? Do we know? Is this well defined? Is this something that, is it any service? Is it a subset of services?
Well, I think as the member from the Good Tech Fest Department of Human Services, we already have data sharing agreements in place with the Good Tech Fest Department of Labor and their data governance steward around both SNAP and TANF benefit receipts. So I would suggest that we start with those two, since those are already supported by data sharing agreements and would not require additional really data pulling or work by our team or new negotiation of those agreements.
Are we ready to vote then? I feel like I've got all the information that I need to cast my vote. What about you guys?
I think I'm good to vote.
All right.
I think I'm good to go too. And thanks, Matt. You've just reminded me that I don't recall any particular breaches by the state agencies in the way that my own bank has breached my security so many times. So thank you for reminding me.
All right. So I think all in favor of adopting this new use case, raise your hand in the Zoom. I can't because I'm sharing my screen.
I can't either.
So I'm going to raise my hand here.
I guess we're on video too. We could raise our hands as well.
Yeah, we'll raise our actual hands this time. All right, then the vote passes, and we will be adopting that use case as stated, and we will move into implementation, which is a already previously defined process, and it'll just be a very smooth transition. Okay, we have 5. Thank you guys, and thank you, Kristen, for participating in that very quick governance board. That's how we like them to go. We have 5 minutes, so I think we've got some questions in the chat, and then if anybody else has any other questions for any of us here, then let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to stop sharing.
So one question we just had come through the chat is, to what extent would such an application be individualized versus average outcomes? Also considering disparities between different population groups. So I think, those would be very different. Well, they would be different conversations for approving that use case. I think generally when we do this work, we might start with the aggregate outcomes to see how much information does that provide? What types of policy questions does that answer? But then set it up in such a way that maybe those a little bit more granular outcomes can be calculated. So being able to approve, can we, calculate these outcomes for people who went through this training program, receive this benefit, and have these demographic characteristics. I think a lot of that, and Michael could speak more to this, is really, also taking into consideration any restrictions around like cell sizes or things like that, that are already in place within the state agencies. But it's also a difference between, is this data first being made available for state policy analysts only, or is it being made available to the public, knowing that those could be different granularities for different audiences?
Sure, and just if it's an example of maybe a research project, a researcher that's coming and wanting to help us answer a question, and we would be doing de-identified but individual level data. I think that would also, yes, be definitely maybe a different type of conversation within the Data Trust Committee and what that means and looks like. I'd also say if we're working with a researcher, especially let's say at an institution of higher ed, they might have also an IRB process that would be part of that. So I think that might be something that we at the Data Trust would say, before we feel comfortable giving that de-identified individual level data, we want to make sure that we see what your IRB approval looks like to be able to do some of this work. So I think being able to navigate some of that too, is if something like that were to come forward.
Really quickly before we run out of time, I want to let you all know that we can continue this conversation on the BrightHive community Slack, and here is the link to join it. It's brighthive.io/slack-community-sign-up. If you're not already a member, please do, and we will provide that charter template that we viewed there in the Slack as a Word doc, so you guys can take that and make it your own. And then we also have some resources on brighthive.io/data governance from our keynote participants. They provided some resources as well as some that BrightHive has put out. So I want to just flag that for you guys before folks jump off. And I think it would be great if maybe some of the questions that we didn't get to that are in the chat, if we continue those conversations over in the community Slack, if folks are okay with that.
I'll make sure and copy these down. Great.
And I see Jessica has her hand raised, but.
Oh, yeah.
That may have been from the vote, but Jessica, if you have a question, feel free to ask it.
That was from the vote. Sorry, I didn't take it down. The reactions they'll come down, but no, this was great. Thank you so much. I really appreciated the kind of quick demo through an actual governance meeting and picked up a few things I hadn't heard before. So thanks y'all so much.
Great.
All right. Well, we are right at the hour, and I'm sure people have other Zoom meetings to get to, but I really appreciate all of you taking the time to join us today. Thank you again to Michael and Autumn for being here today and being a part of this conversation. Look forward to continuing the conversation in our community Slack. So please reach out and sign up for that, and we will look forward to staying in touch. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye.